London, 1888. Decades before the rise of the infamous Peaky Blinders, while Queen Victoria ruled an empire that stretched across the globe. The British economy was booming and India was under firm colonial control. Men like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Oscar Wilde, H.G. Wells, or little Winston Churchill were walking in London's streets. But those streets, exactly at that time, became the most notorious and extremely haunted by the fear of gruesome bloodshed, gory mutilation, and mysterious murder. The case startled not only the Scotland Yard but also the whole world, because it remained unsolved to date, making it one of the biggest unsolved mysteries ever. So what kind of enigma was this? What really happened there, and what are we missing? Are the answers just in front of us, or are they lost forever? Let's find out in this video today. Back in 1888, East London wasn't exactly the nicest place to be. It was rough, full of working-class people just trying to get by, and some areas were downright dangerous. And one of the worst was Whitechapel. Crime, poverty, you name it, they had it all. Now, on the early morning of August 31st, around 3:40 a.m., two local guys, Charles Cross and Robert Paul, were walking down Bucks Row. It was quiet and dark, the kind of night where even the smallest sound makes you look over your shoulder. That's when they spotted something, a bundle lying there on the side of the road. But something about it felt off. When they got closer, their worst fears became real. It wasn't just some pile of rags, it was a woman. Turns out it was Mary Ann Nichols, a prostitute brutally murdered. Her throat was slashed, her stomach mutilated. The police figured the killer had struck about 30 minutes earlier. But strangely enough, despite the area being known for shady business, no one saw or heard a thing. Fast forward to September 8th, just over a week later. At around 4:45 a.m., a man stopped briefly at 29 Hanbury Street. He walked through the front entrance, down the hall, and into the backyard. He sat on the steps, casually trimmed a piece of leather from his boot with a knife, then left, shutting the front door behind him. An hour later, a tenant came downstairs and found the front door wide open. The back door, however, was closed. Curious, he pushed it open, only to be met with a gruesome sight. A woman's mutilated body lay below the steps. This was Annie Chapman, also a prostitute, who had at least 7 children, though only 2 had survived. Like Nichols, she had also been staying in a lodging house but had been turned away the night before for not having enough money. Annie was killed in an even more gruesome way. Her abdomen was completely torn open and her intestines had been pulled out and placed on her shoulder. Plus, here's the creepy part, her killer had taken her uterus. Near the victim's feet, the detectives found a small piece of cloth and 2 combs, seemingly arranged on purpose. The post-mortem examination revealed more disturbing details. 2 brass rings had been forcibly removed from her left hand. Dr. Phillips noted that the precision of the cuts suggested a thorough medical knowledge. This was someone who knew a lot about anatomy. But the terror had actually begun a few weeks earlier, on August 7th. That morning, someone had found the body of a woman in the George Yard buildings. She had been stabbed 39 times, mostly in the chest and stomach. A doctor later said she had likely been killed around 2:30 a.m. But here's the weird thing, there was no blood anywhere beyond the staircase where she was found. Meaning, she was attacked right there, and even though there were plenty of people in the building, only one person, Amy Hewitt, claimed she heard something. A single scream, murder. The victim was later identified as Martha Tabram, a 39-year-old mother of 2. The night before, she had been drinking with another woman, Mary Ann Connolly, and 2 soldiers. At some point, she and one of the men went into George Yard. That was the last time she was seen alive. Later, a soldier was spotted hanging around outside, saying he was waiting for his friend, and not long after, Martha was dead. Detectives tried to track down the soldiers, but every suspect had an alibi. The only 2 people who got a good look at the men, Connolly and a police officer, ended up misidentifying them. And just like that, the case hit a dead end. Martha's murder wasn't officially linked to the later Jack the Ripper killings, but it had all the makings of something bigger. And as we already mentioned, in the months that followed, Whitechapel would become the cursed place of murders. Now, though the police admitted they had no leads, there was one unsettling similarity. All these women were prostitutes and had been viciously attacked, and neither had been robbed. While Tabram was repeatedly stabbed, Nichols had been slashed, and Annie, her intestines were completely messed up like you see in any gore or slasher movies. The methods were different, but something about the sheer brutality suggested the same killer. A witness, Elizabeth Long, later came forward with a chilling account. On the night of Annie Chapman's murder, around 5:30 a.m., she had seen a man talking to a woman outside 29 Hanbury Street. She was fairly certain the woman was Annie Chapman, though she couldn't see the man's face. She overheard a short exchange. "Will you?" the man asked. "Yes," the woman replied, "and that's it." But this testimony created a problem. Dr. Phillips, who arrived at the scene at 6:30 a.m., estimated that Chapman had been dead for at least 2 hours, putting her time of death at around 4:30 a.m. But if that were true, how could Elizabeth Long have seen her alive an hour later? Then there was John Richardson, the tenant's son. At around 4:45 a.m., he had gone into the backyard to check that the basement door was locked. He even sat on the steps, the very same steps where Chapman's body was later found, to trim a piece of leather from his boot. He was adamant. There had been no body there when he sat down. Another neighbor, Albert Kadash, recalled hearing voices near the crime scene at around 5:20 a.m. He didn't catch what was said, but he distinctly heard a faint cry of "no." Moments later, something heavy thudded against the wooden fence that separated the properties. All these conflicting testimonies made it nearly impossible to determine exactly when Chapman was killed. Dr. Phillips later admitted that the cold morning and the amount of blood loss could have thrown off his estimation. If he was wrong and the witnesses were slightly mistaken about the time, Chapman's murder might have actually taken place closer to 5:30 a.m. in daylight. Yet somehow the killer managed to commit such a gruesome act and disappear without a trace. But the body count kept rising, so did fear. The press ripped into Scotland Yard, calling them incompetent. The truth was, they were facing an impossible task: an unknown murderer with no clear motive, no solid evidence, and a labyrinth of dark alleys packed with people. A newspaper at the time summed it up best: trying to catch this killer was like searching for a grain of sand in an endless desert. And the worst part? The murders weren't over yet. But on September 27th, a bombshell was dropped. Central News Agency received an anonymous letter that said, "Meanwhile, just 3 days later, on the night of September 30th, the air is damp and the city is on edge." Just a few blocks northeast of a gruesome crime scene, someone stumbles upon a blood-stained piece of cloth near a building entrance. Turns out it's a torn piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron, ripped right off as the killer made his getaway. But that's not even the most chilling part. Right above where the cloth was found, scrawled on the wall, was an eerie message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." No one could figure out exactly what it meant. Was it a message from the killer? A clue? A diversion? Some thought it was meant to stir up anti-Jewish sentiment, while others believed it was just random graffiti with no connection at all. And then, the letters started rolling in. Just 3 days before Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were murdered, the Central News Agency of London received a letter from someone claiming to be the killer. The writer took credit for previous murders and hinted at more bloodshed to come. Then, right after the two women were killed, a postcard, this time smeared with blood, arrived at the same agency. The writer referred to the night's horror as a double event, even sharing gruesome details only the murderer could have known. At first, investigators thought the killer might be hiding in plain sight, walking among them, living right there in the same neighborhood. They decided to keep the double murder detail under wraps, hoping to trip up whoever was behind it. But then, just when they thought they had a handle on things, another letter, same handwriting, landed at the police department on October 1st. The police, desperate to figure out who was behind these eerie letters, decided to make them public. Maybe someone would recognize the handwriting or have a clue about the writer. But nope, nothing. Right away, people started arguing. Were the letters real or just some twisted prank? One of the most chilling lines in the Dear Boss letter was a promise to clip the lady's ears off and send them to the police. That never happened, at least not exactly, but when Catherine Eddowes' body was found, her right earlobe was partially cut. So was it a sick follow-through on the threat or just a gruesome coincidence? No one knows for sure. Experts have studied the writing and believe all the letters came from the same person. But whether that person was the actual killer is still up for debate. Interestingly, the handwriting didn't match a message scrawled above a bloody piece of apron found at one of the crime scenes. But once the letters hit the press, copycats jumped on the bandwagon, flooding the city with more and more disturbing notes. Most were dismissed, but one particular letter, that one stood out, not just for what it said, but for what came with it. Let me tell you about this one. On October 16th, George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a package straight out of a horror movie. Inside was a letter and a small box. When he opened the box, he found half of a human kidney. A real flesh and blood kidney. Doctors confirmed it was human, but whether it belonged to Eddowes? That was never 100% proven. The letter's writer claimed they'd eaten the other half, but many suspected it was an elaborate hoax. Medical students or someone with access to human organs could have easily pulled it off. There's this theory that a lot of the infamous letters tied to the case were actually fake, just made-up stories from the press. Chief Inspector John Littlechild even called them a smart piece of journalistic work, basically a fancy way of saying, yeah, some reporter probably wrote this for attention. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson had the same hunch, brushing them off as the work of an enterprising London journalist. And Chief Constable Melville McNacton? He was pretty sure the press was involved too, though nobody ever proved who was behind it. But then, just like that, the killings seemed to stop. People started to wonder, had the murderer gotten scared, had they moved on, or had they simply decided to quit while they were ahead? And then came November 9th. That morning, a landlord named John McCarthy was going through his books when he noticed one of his tenants in Miller's Court, room 13, was behind on rent. He sent his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, to collect. Bowyer knocked, no answer, knocked again, still nothing. So he peeked through the window, but a cloth was in the way. Reaching through a broken pane, he pulled it aside, and what he saw, he would never forget. Miller's Court was in chaos within minutes. Police swarmed the place, but the door to room 13 was locked. They had to break it down with a pickaxe, and what was inside was straight out of a nightmare. The body was mutilated beyond recognition. The face was destroyed, the throat cut so deep the bone was visible. Her abdomen had been opened, organs removed, and scattered around the room. The place itself was nearly bare, just a couple of tables, a chair or two, and a small cabinet. In the fireplace, police found burned clothing. Maybe the killer tried to destroy evidence, maybe they just wanted warmth. The victim was identified quickly, Mary Jane Kelly, the woman renting room 13. But here's the thing, no one really knew much about her. She was said to be in her mid-20s, possibly Welsh or Irish, but there were no real records of her existence. Some even suspected that wasn't her real name. Kelly had recently split from her partner, Joseph Barnett. They had been living together, but he left on October 30th after too many arguments, mostly about her lifestyle. Still, he kept in touch and had visited her the night before she died. Later that night, a neighbor named Mary Ann Cox saw Kelly outside her place, drunk and barely able to stand. Around 2 a.m., another man, George Hutchinson, ran into her. She asked him for money. He said no. Also, a well-dressed man approached her and she left with him. Hutchinson thought the guy looked suspicious, so he followed them to Miller's Court and watched as they went inside. Around 4 a.m., a neighbor upstairs heard a woman cry, "Murder." But in that part of Whitechapel, that wasn't exactly rare, so no one thought much of it. Experts later estimated Kelly had been killed between 1 and 2 a.m., but things didn't quite add up. Some people claimed to have seen her alive later that morning. Was she really dead that early, or was there more to it? We may never know. As for the killer, Dr. Thomas Bond painted a picture of someone strong, middle-aged, and unremarkable. Just another face in the crowd. He didn't believe the murderer had any real medical training, despite how precise the mutilations seemed. Witness descriptions were all over the place, but most agreed on a man of average height, medium to stocky build, dressed in dark clothes, often with a mustache. But can we even trust those accounts? Some doubt if anyone actually saw the real killer. There are even theories that the Ripper wasn't a man at all. Could it have been a woman like Jill the Ripper? No evidence, but people still speculate, and one thing's for sure. Whoever it was, they knew the East End like the back of their hand. The way they moved, the way they avoided capture, it suggests a deep familiarity with the area. Some believe they had a job, given how the murders often happened around weekends or holidays. And while Dr. Bond didn't think they had medical training, others weren't so sure. More than a century later, we're still asking the same question. Who was Jack the Ripper? And we may never get the answer. But they assembled some possible suspects, though. some just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and one of those suspects might be the real killer as well. Take John Richardson, for example. He was just minding his business, fixing his boot at the scene of one of the murders. Naturally, the cops suspected him, but when they looked into it, they realized he actually had a good reason to be there. His mom lived nearby. With no solid evidence against him, they let him go. Then there was George Hutchinson. Now this guy followed Mary Jane Kelly after spotting her with a well-dressed man. Why, no one really knows. Maybe he was worried about her, or maybe he was hoping to get something out of it. He was unemployed, after all. The police questioned him, but he managed to convince Inspector Aberline that he had nothing to do with the killings. And then there's Charles Cross, or should I say Charles Lechmere. He was the one who found Mary Ann Nichols' body. At first, it seemed like he just stumbled upon it, but later, people started wondering if he was actually the killer and just pretending to be an innocent passerby. Adding to the mystery, he used his stepfather's surname Cross instead of his real one, Lechmere. And his daily route to work lined up suspiciously well with the locations of the murders, except for one Sunday when there was a double killing, his only day off. Coincidence? Maybe. But the guy lived his life in East London until 1920 without ever being officially accused. Then again, a lot of the case files disappeared over time, so who knows what the police really thought. Now let's talk about Joseph Barnett. He was Mary Jane Kelly's boyfriend and lived with her until shortly before she was killed. He lost his job, money got tight, and Mary Jane went back to prostitution to make ends meet. Some theories suggest Barnett might have killed her, and maybe even the others, to scare her into quitting. But there was no real proof, and the theory was also quite laughable. And after 4 hours of questioning, the police let him go. Then there's Aaron Kosminski, the Polish barber who's been a top suspect for ages. A high-ranking officer, Robert Anderson, claimed the Ripper had been identified, and later sources confirmed the guy's last name was Kosminski. He was known to hear voices and had paranoid delusions, but his only recorded act of violence was threatening his sister with a knife. Some cops thought he was guilty, others weren't so sure. In 2011, a shawl supposedly linked to one of the victims was tested for DNA. The results suggested a match with Kosminski's descendants, but here's the catch. The shawl's origin is sketchy at best, and mitochondrial DNA can't confirm someone's identity beyond a doubt. So despite some dramatic headlines, the case still isn't officially solved. And don't think the suspect list is over. There's the wild card, Francis Tumblety. This guy was a real character. Born in Ireland, raised in the US, and making a name for himself as a sketchy Indian herb doctor, he peddled bogus remedies and got into trouble more times than you can count. Everything from theft to manslaughter. At one point, people even linked him to Lincoln's assassination, though that turned out to be nonsense. He also had some seriously weird hobbies. Supposedly, he threw an all-male dinner party in Washington, where he ranted about how much he hated women. He allegedly had a collection of preserved wombs in jars. Yeah, not exactly normal behavior. In 1888, he happened to be in London right when the murders happened, moving around constantly and using fake names. A rumor even spread that a mysterious lodger left behind a blood-stained shirt near one of the murder sites. Some thought it was him, though no proof ever surfaced. Then in November 1888, he got arrested. Some newspapers said it was for the Ripper murders, but in reality, it was for gross indecency. 2 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was killed, and no one's sure if he was still locked up or if he had already been released. Either way, he didn't stick around to find out. He skipped bail, fled to America under a fake name, and despite the authorities keeping an eye on him, they never extradited him back to England. But the thing is, how did he become a suspect in the first place? You see, Francis Tumblety, a tall, flashy guy with a thing for dressing extravagantly, happens to be in London right when the Ripper murders are happening. Now people start whispering that he collected human body parts, which sounds super creepy. But this whole rumor actually comes from just one article published in December 1888. And the guy behind it? Charles Dunham, an absolute pro at lying, forging documents, and scamming people. Basically, it's one scammer exploiting another. Tumblety didn't even match the descriptions of Jack the Ripper. He was this towering, eye-catching figure, the kind of guy you'd notice a mile away. Whitechapel was full of dark, shadowy alleys, and the Ripper was known for slipping away unseen. Tumblety? Not exactly the best fit for that. Then there's the whole brass ring mystery. When Annie Chapman was murdered, her 2 brass rings went missing. Some think the Ripper took them as trophies. Fast forward to 1903, when Tumblety dies, and what do they find among his stuff? A pair of cheap imitation rings. A coincidence? Maybe. But there's no solid proof linking them to the crime. Now Chief Inspector John Littlechild, he was convinced Tumblety was a prime suspect. The guy had the opportunity, maybe even the motive. But Tumblety was also a master of deception and self-promotion, making it almost impossible to separate fact from fiction. And lastly, we should not miss one name who was also considered as a suspect, because this one will give you goosebumps. His name was James Maybrick. He wasn't from Whitechapel. He lived far away in a big house called Battlecrease Mansion in Liverpool. Maybrick was a businessman in the cotton industry, but some people believe he had a dark secret. The main reason people suspect him is a diary that was supposedly his. This diary describes the gruesome murders in detail, almost as if the killer himself wrote it. At the end of one entry, a chilling line appears. "I give my name that all know of me, so history do tell what love can do to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." If this diary is real, it could mean James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper. But there's a problem. The diary mentions events that happened after the final murder, which makes many doubt its authenticity. Then another strange clue appeared, a golden pocket watch. Engraved on it were the initials of the 5 women Jack the Ripper killed, and the words, "I am Jack, J. Maybrick." Forensic tests suggested the engraving was dated back to around 1846. At first, a man named Mike Barrett claimed he had found the diary, and that it belonged to James Maybrick. But later he took back his story, making things even more confusing. Despite these intriguing clues, no solid proof connects Maybrick to the murders. Like many other theories, this one remains debated, and the true identity of Jack the Ripper is still a mystery. At the end of the day, after all the research and speculation, we still don't know if the real Jack the Ripper is even on our list of suspects. Every theory has its flaws, and the evidence is mostly circumstantial. Victorian London was a massive, chaotic place, packed with people coming and going. The Ripper could have been just some ordinary guy who vanished into the crowds, leaving behind nothing but mystery. And that's how, with lots of theories, lots of dead ends, and after all these years, the mystery is still unsolved. What's your thought about it? Do you have any specific theory about it? Share your thoughts in the comments. But this next case, it's exactly the opposite of it, where the killer might be walking around in plain sight, but there was no body at all. How did the police solve the case? Watch this next case and subscribe to the channel for more. See you soon.